8:25 in a three-part documentary starting tonight on BBC4, we get a look back at the era when the extreme left was a serious and significant political force that believed it could change the world for the better. The programme, appropriately enough, is called Lefties.
We actually thought that we could produce a revolution. We could produce very radical change in the way things were organised. We could increase the power of ordinary people, of working people, and so forth. We could reduce oppression, all those sorts of things. We thought all those things could be done at that time. We were trying to do them.
It was a politicised generation. I mean, we were Marxists, I suppose. Dialectical materialism and historical materialism were phrases that tripped off the tongue.
Well, there we are, a taste of that programme that you can see in full at 9 o'clock this evening on BBC4. Is left-wing now an outmoded concept, or have the left merely adapted and taken power as New Labour? Peter Hitchens, the Mail on Sunday columnist and a former Marxist, is here. So is Lindsey German from the Socialist Workers' Party, who stood as a respect candidate at the last election. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Peter Hitchens, 20 years ago, the left in this country used to be the focus of every political debate. Do you think the far left is now dead? Has it lost the political argument for good?
Good heavens, no. You just heard the Secretary of State for Defence using the phrase pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, which is a quotation from the leading Marxist theoretician Antonio Gramsci. The man is a former member of the Communist Party. The new Labour government is stuffed with allegedly ex-Marxists who've simply adopted other means, the cultural revolution as opposed to the old proletarian revolution which they used to seek and which, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, became irrelevant. The left has simply changed its tactics and pursues its end by other means, but it's immensely powerful, far more powerful than it was in the shouting days of the 1960s and 1970s. After all, demonstrations are a sign of impotence. When did you last see supermarket owners demonstrating in the streets for more power? They don't need to because they're there, and you don't really need much of an extreme left now when you have people like Mr. Reid sitting in government in important posts.
Well, as you say, people adapt and change, policies adapt and change, and as we've seen, all the political parties seem to have abandoned their original directives and are trying to step onto the centre ground. Is it pragmatism?
Well, the centre ground is just what happens to suit politicians at the moment and what happens to suit the political elite. They declare what they believe to be right as the centre ground and classify anyone who disagrees with them as an extremist. It's an essentially meaningless phrase, but the centre ground is enormously further to the left of where it was in the 60s and 70s. You have, for instance, the Conservative Party now almost entirely swallowing the prescriptions of political correctness, which is cultural Marxism.
You seem to be suggesting then that left-wing has become politically correct. Let me just put that point to Lindsey German. Do you think that the lefties have lost the plot now? There's no hope?
Well, I'm rather surprised that Peter Hitchens thinks that John Reid is somehow an example of socialist advance, or that the new Labour government is, given that it has presided over a series of privatisations, wars, attacks on the welfare state, all of which mean that the centre ground, as it's called, has been pushed further to the right. And actually, the consensus in politics today is very much a more right-wing consensus than it was in the 70s. Now, actually, this contrasts with most people's view, if you look at opinion polls, and if you look at British social attitudes and things like that, which show that a majority of people in this country are in favour of many of the things that we fought for in the 70s and in the 60s. And I believe that really there's a great deal of unfinished business. Far from having political correctness rife here in Britain, I think that we still have women earning at best 4/5 of men. We still have discrimination against gays. We still have racism and Islamophobia in this country. These are all real and pressing issues which the 60s and 70s tried to address.
Lindsay, you really ought to be more cheerful about the achievements.
I'm a very cheerful person.
Of your movement. You've actually achieved far more than you acknowledge. For heaven's sake, the police are now an organ of political correctness. And what more could you ask? The whole state of this country now directs itself towards the enforcement of all the ideas which you and your comrades fought for back in the 60s and 70s. Please, recognise your triumph.
Well,
Stop being so unhappy about it. You've done very well.
The programme tonight, it's very kind of you to concede this, but unfortunately I
wish it weren't true.
I think that the world that we live in is not a socialist utopia, and I think you must live in a very rarefied atmosphere if you think that it is. Let's take one example, the question of housing, which is the subject of the programme tonight, which is about squatting. The housing crisis today is much, much worse than it was in the 1970s. There is a serious problem problem. There is no council housing being built. People can't afford to buy houses. These are real questions which still exist.
Isn't that because society has changed and moved on? You've gone from the days of union power and industrialised society through to the 80s, the Thatcherite revolution, if you like, the loads of money type tendency.
I think that's right, and I think this is to the detriment of society, that we now have inequality greater than it has ever been, and that is why you've seen the development in the last few years of movements like the movement around Seattle, like the movement against the war, which is the biggest political movement ever in this country, which has had to demonstrate in order to try to stop the government's war drive.
But you yourself have been accused of ditching some of your own ideologies for political means. You've been criticised by some small far-left groups for abandoning your advocacy of equal rights for lesbians, gay men, bisexuals and transgender people to please some of the Muslim opponents of the war. So you yourself have shifted and changed.
That just simply isn't true. I stand for gay rights and I stand for lesbian rights, and so do most socialists that I know. So that simply isn't true. What I think is true is that we're faced with a new generation of people who are looking towards socialist ideas, looking towards left-wing ideas, and I think that the movements today are the answer to those people.
All right, Peter Hitchens, do you think the old left-right paradigms really have shifted when you see George Galloway, for example, going on Big Brother, and you yourself, right-wingers like you, David Cameron now saying that the Conservatives have the same attitude as the Liberal Democrats towards the Iraq war?
No, I think what's happened is that the categories have shifted, and people have to recognise that since the end of the Cold War, the arguments are much more about culture, sexual politics, and about who actually controls organisations such as the BBC than the old Marxist plan, seize the post office, seize the barracks, pall of smoke over the city, gunfire and the red flag flying over the town hall. What the Marxists decided to do back in the 60s was to go on a long march through the institutions of the country to change the way people thought. And that is what they have succeeded in doing, to the extent that the Conservative Party now accepts huge numbers of the things which Marxists were arguing for back in the 60s and doesn't even realise it.
What a thought. We've got to end it there, I'm afraid. Peter Hitchens and Lindsey German, thank you both very much.
Thank you.